Hey, it's Sarah Burke here from the Women in Media podcast. And before we get started on a new episode, could I get you to hit like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell, whichever app you do your podcast listening in. Make sure you're all set up so you know when there's a new episode and you can help spread the word. Oh, and if you're so inclined, could I ask you to leave a review if the app that you're using does that? You're the best. All right, let's get to the show. I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. My guest for this episode is a Juno Award-winning artist and a radio host.
My first residency with Manitoba Music in 2018, I went there and I didn't know anybody except Leela Gilday, and I left with like best friends forever. I remember leaving that place and being like, I just felt that's something that other people have felt their entire lives. All of a sudden, it was like I understood who I was in a way that I'd never understood before. And I was 38 years old.
You're going to make me cry right now.
I'm trying not to. Like, it was honestly, in a way, it makes me so sad that it took that long to feel that. But God, did it ever change my life.
You are my first musician guest on this podcast, which I think is going to throw people off, knowing that I work, very heavily in music.
Hi.
Joining me from Edmonton, Alberta, where the record that won her a Juno last year was written. Is that right?
That's right.
Stories from a Downtown Apartment. Celeigh Cardinal, how are you?
I am really good. I just had the most sleep I've had in like weeks. So I'm feeling amazing right now. I was getting about 4 or 5 hours sleep per night. I was waking up at like 4 to 5 o'clock in the morning to like start working. And also being in Alberta and working with folks who are in Ontario means that I'm behind. If I wake up at 8 o'clock, it's already 10 o'clock in the morning for you. So yeah. I felt like I was kind of trying to keep up, but I just had like 10 hours sleep and it was amazing and I feel great.
By the way, I have to say I listened to Ahead by Century, your version this morning. What an amazing take on a song everyone knows. I love it.
Thank you. It's like, it's kind of the brainchild of James, who is the producer.
Yeah.
Because I mean, when I sent him a demo of it, it was like me playing piano, sort of like ballady. And he was like, but let's not do that. Let's, make it a little bit more upbeat. And I was like, okay. And then we just built this song from like everybody sort of just sending pieces in. And yeah, it was really cool.
Okay. So we're kind of, in this standstill of the music industry right now. You have managed to release a little of music and we'll talk about that, but you've also been hosting a radio show, filling in on another radio show. Tell me about all your things right now. What's like a week look like for Celeigh Cardinal?
Oh, a week for me. Well, it's been ever changing because there's been a lot of, I've been really fortunate. I've been really busy. I've actually, so far this year has been probably the best year of my career. Like I've been so busy. I'm doing a lot of pre-records. So between, I would say there's like anywhere from 2 to 4 pre-records for festivals that I'm doing a month, which involves maybe some slight travel to like Calgary or to other parts in Southern Alberta. We've gone to Manitoba a few times and done a couple of performances in Winnipeg too. But it's always very like, we go there, we perform, and then we leave. We don't really get to hang out. It's very COVID friendly. So it doesn't feel the same, but yeah, so I've been doing a lot of that. I've also had a little secret project that I can't talk about yet, but I'm so excited about, and it's huge, that I've been working on. I was working on pretty steady for about a month. And so I have a weekly radio show at CKUA in Edmonton. And then I've been filling in at CBC Edmonton for a show that's all Alberta musicians. That is wrapping up now, and it's time for me to start writing some music. So I was actually talking to my producer yesterday about how like my schedule's been so busy. It's time for me to like clear space and like declutter my schedule. I need to declutter my home. I'm so glad you can't see all of it. But I generally need to declutter. And I'm just really excited to start writing music and to make space for doing that. So this pace that I've been going at for a little while, it's been pretty wild, but I'm going to take a break.
Yeah. So you've been a musician since what year? When did you start?
Okay. So I started playing in bars, in 1999.
So here we are, like 20 years later, and you just had the biggest, career year of your life. You won the Juno for the Indigenous Album of the Year last year. And I think, I hate talking about the Indigenous music category, and we could probably spend an entire episode on just that. But I think that did help you get a little more attention on your music, if anything, which is a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And I mean, it was, we didn't get to have the awards ceremony. I didn't get to do it the way that it's normally done. And there's pros and cons with that. There's pros and cons with every situation. But like when I was sitting in Saskatoon waiting for the awards to start, I was so anxious. I was so nervous. I'm a pretty introverted person, honestly. So this whole event was going to be so huge and really, push me past my comfort zone. So there was like this tiny bit of relief when it was all canceled. Yeah. And the really cool part was that I got to accept the award or find out that I won the award when I had just my family around me.
I saw really that.
Beautiful. Yeah. So, that was really, that worked out just fine for me. And it did really open doors during a time when a lot of people weren't getting work. So that's why it kind of, I have a lot of gratitude for that, because it could have been a really, really quiet year for me, but it wasn't. It ended up being busy because of it.
So what do you think it was about that record, Stories from a Downtown Apartment, that made this all happen?
That's a great question. I remember I was coming back from New Orleans from Folk Alliance.
Where I met you.
Yeah. And that was the day before the announcements for the nominations were going to be made. I was sitting on the plane and I sat and listened to my whole album. And I was like, you know what? I'm happy with this album. It said what I needed it to say. It totally expressed how I was feeling in that time. And if it doesn't get a nomination, I'm totally okay with it. And I just let myself be at peace, because I was anxious, this thing, it could happen, this thing I've always dreamed of. And that's just that's a really anxious thing. And once I kind of made that peace with it, and the next day I actually got the nomination, it was so validating, first of all, so validating. And I have been doing this for a really long time. Yeah. And a big part of why it's taken so long is because when I was 23, I had a son, and I've been a single parent for the duration of his life. And so I couldn't pursue music full time when I had a baby or when I had a toddler, all those years. So it wasn't until he was about 14 in 2016 that I started pursuing music full on, quit my day jobs and just did this. And once I started to get busy, that's when he had to go live with my mother. And the album, I think what it was is that when I write, I'm so literal. I'm so honest. I'm too honest sometimes. I'm an oversharer. And I think that there's a lot of things that people can see themselves in. In the song, I Don't Want to Know You Anymore, it's just saying, listen, I thought I could be okay with this, but I can't even see you, and I think that there's a lot of people that resonates with. Oh yeah. I think it was just because I was okay with authentically telling my story, and I sing it very emotionally because I feel it. I still feel it.
Yeah. So flip over to the Radio House side of you. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't you say that is the exact same thing that you look for in a song from someone else?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I have to feel it. There's a lot of things that are markers for me when it comes to radio. There's one thing that I can't handle is if there's any sort of bad pitch in the song. I'm I just can't do it. There's some no-go spaces for me, but we make exceptions for that. There's songs where Neil Young, it's not always the most perfect sound, but that he's feeling it. And that took me a while to really accept and to love imperfections, Mm-hmm. But imperfections that have real feel behind them. That's amazing. Yeah. That's the ticket.
Yeah. So tell me about getting into radio. When did that happen for you?
It basically just happened because a senior producer at CKUA, I did an interview with a couple of hosts at this festival in Grand Prairie. I think it was back in 2017. And he just approached me after the interview, like a couple of weeks later, and said, "Hey, would you be interested in putting in a demo?" He just liked the way that I spoke in the interview.
I feel like this same conversation might have happened between you and I about it. You got a thing. You got a thing.
I mean, I think, I think people like my talking voice, which in my head always sounds really high and annoying, but I think that's something that happens to all of us. But yeah, so he just got me to make a demo. I did. And it started off with me just sort of taking some fill-in shifts and kind of learning how to work the board. And then after about a year, I was offered an hour to do my own show, whatever I wanted to do with it. And
anything you want. That's beautiful. In radio, that doesn't always happen.
Yeah, it's lucky. This is an Alberta-wide radio station that is like donor and community supported. So it's, they can break a few rules. It's not commercial.
I love that.
And then, I said, well, it's got to be an all Indigenous hour. I need people to hear beyond what they think Indigenous music is.
Yes. Okay, so now let's get into, your profile as an Indigenous artist and the music that's inspired you growing up. Were there Indigenous artists that inspired you to get into music?
There were not.
Okay.
And that's because there weren't very many ever. And there were so few that I actually ever saw. So growing up, my father, who is Métis, he was actually brought up in foster care, and they were all white Christian homes. So he was never really taught anything about his culture, and he had 8 siblings. They were all separated. He didn't have anybody to learn from. So it wasn't until I was older and I was kind of I knew I was Indigenous, and these were things that we kind of sort of touched on a little bit. And I definitely had to deal with the racism that came along with being Indigenous, living in Northern Alberta, but without actually having any sort of culture or, any identity in my heritage to sort of cling on to as a pillar to kind of help me through that, navigate through that. So what I ended up doing was it just ended up leading to a lot of internalized shame and a lot of me sort of negating it and kind of trying to ignore this part of myself. So as I got older, I started to realize that this was something that I needed to get to know. And when I was 19, I started working for the Grand Prairie Friendship Center as I was a speech assistant aide at the preschool that they had. So I started learning Cree words along with these 3 to 5 year olds. And so that's how much Cree I can speak, by the way. I can say tanse and a few other words, but that put me in a community for the first time, in an Indigenous community. And so it wasn't until I was, 19, 20 that I started to kind of understand this. And I'm still sort of without, my community, my Indigenous community is basically the Canadian Indigenous community of musicians in Canada. That's the place where I have found that I feel at home the most when I'm at things like the International Indigenous Summit that Shoshona and Amanda usually head up, and just any of the residencies that I've done that Alan Grey Eyes or Manitoba Music have put on, Jade Harper. It's just within those experiences that that's when I experienced the community, the Indigenous community. Right. So and also I grew up Christian too, so I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music. Oh, so I didn't discover Buffy Sainte-Marie until I was older. And when I did, I mean, oh man,
how did we not?
I know.
Yeah. And I felt that way too. When I first listened to Buffy, I was like, it's kind of crazy that I'm just learning about Buffy Sainte-Marie.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I actually, in 2008, I got a chance to open for her. 2008, yeah, something like that. And I mean, it was so cool. And I remember I went up and played a couple of my, sad songs. And then Buffy goes up, and I think at the time, okay, this was probably 2010. So I think that would make her 70 at the time.
Okay.
the most energy I've ever seen on stage in my life. And the songs are so upbeat. And I'm like, oh, why did I open like that? I had so much regret. But, she's very sweet. I met her then. And then I met her a few years ago at the International Indigenous Summit again in Montreal, because she was one of the keynote speakers. And I was in a group with her and a bunch of other Indigenous musicians from across Canada. And I said, you know what? I actually opened for you back in 2010. And then everyone in that circle was like, I opened for you too. I opened for you too. And it was just wild, because she is somebody who not only like has, trailblazed for Indigenous representation and folk music and, activism. Like, she's just a trailblazer in all the ways, but it's Indigenous artists get a chance to have more exposure because they open for her at her shows. She's helping us grow our own audiences too. I just think she's like amazing in so many ways. And now looking at her, I'm like, that's the kind of career that I want to have. That's exactly what I want.
I remember when I interviewed her, I think it was 2018. It must have been 2018. She was putting out that new record with some of the reworked songs. And I found it so interesting that, when she's doing press to support her new project, she was talking about all these other up and coming emerging musicians. When I listened back to that audio, she's talking about like Tribe Called Red, and she was talking about Tanya, and like, that's the kind of woman she is. Yeah. Right there.
Yeah. Yep. You have the space, and then you share it. Yes. And you use it. And that's all I care about doing now.
Yeah, totally. So tell me about your all Indigenous radio show.
So it's ever changing. Each week it's a new playlist. I try to bring in as much new music as possible, but I'm constantly doing so much research to find new artists, because there's not one place that you can find up and coming Indigenous artists. I basically find artists through Instagram. I take a look at other Indigenous artist playlists on like Spotify or Apple Music. Like, I'm just like, or the Indigenous Music Countdown is a place that I find new musicians all the time too. So I'm kind of doing like, grassroots work to find artists, but it's basically 1 hour, and it's eclectic. It's an eclectic mix of all music from all over the world. I've featured Sami artists. I've done I did a Mexico show. Cool. And and it's like, it's contemporary mostly, but I do bring in like traditional and, older music as well, like Willie Dunn and Ernest Muniz, and, just like lots of variety. But it's basically it's a celebration of all types of Indigenous music. And I often get feedback that says, I didn't even realize this was an Indigenous hour, or I didn't even realize that this person was Indigenous, So it's just like, it's something that makes me feel really good. And it also enhances my network too, and gives me more people to kind of be in my community.
Yeah. So not to get like too heavy here, but I follow you on socials, and you have bad days just like everyone else. And, you do use the word shame, I've noticed in a lot of your posts and how you're feeling. So how do you work through those feelings that have come from racism growing up now?
Well, I am seeing a therapist. That does help. I started seeing her, it's all been during pandemic. So she's like my Zoom therapist. But it's been amazing, because she's actually, she's Indigenous from Southern America. So she talks about spirituality and different things. It's very cool. So it's a really great match, me and my therapist. But I think a big part of it too was just like, it's actually been so helpful being on social media and hearing other people's stories, and hearing what, other people's experiences are, and seeing myself in them. Like Grace and Grit and I have talked quite a bit. We only see each other at festivals or at these big, national events. And I think we've both always been sort of floaters who didn't know where we belonged. And that pulled us together. And I think about Gray all the time. I think about Gray as like, almost a sibling in a way, somebody who totally understands my experience because they had such a similar experience. And I think that's kind of a big part of my healing, is like making connections and friendships with people who have experienced the same thing and sort of normalize it. And I think also something that's happened is I've stepped into my power more. Once I realized that that being Indigenous is this beautiful thing, and it looks like whatever it looks like to me, and this is me. It changed the way I felt it and the way I saw it. And I also removed people from my life who were people who would evoke that kind of feeling in me too.
Yeah.
So it was really just, a whole bunch of things that kind of led to me sort of releasing the chains of that.
Yeah. In working in the Canadian music department at SiriusXM with our Indigenous channel, there's been some uncomfortable moments, and I'm not ashamed to admit that it's uncomfortable, because I look at what, people like you have gone through growing up, and I'm just like, doesn't matter if I'm feeling uncomfortable. Doesn't matter. This is the work that needs to be done. So, for example, being at the Indigenous Music Summit and the sharing circle at the beginning of the event, where everyone's sort of like setting the tone for the event and why they're there. And I remember, I think it was Miss Panic, I remember hearing Miss Panic talk about feeling othered within Indigenous communities, like not fully belonging. And that uncovered for me an entire new layer that I didn't see. That's what is propelling me to do the work that I'm doing, and making sure that we have more representation from all sorts of Indigenous communities in what we do. So,
and that's part of my inspiration for talking about my experience too, of like, of that feeling, and how, Indigenous experience, it's not the same for everybody. And me growing up without it, I think that's a common thing, because a lot of people were put into foster care, or, just were distanced from their culture because of, religion or residential schools.
I was going to say, let's not forget about residential schools.
Yeah,
This
exactly.
Is why.
So that forced people to not have anything to do with their culture. That's where the shame started. And I think talking about this, what that has done to me has led me to this feeling of imposter syndrome, of not fitting in with Indigenous groups, Indigenous people. So I think the more that I talk about that, the more people who are also feeling this will be able to to see themselves in that, and then maybe they'll reclaim their Indigenous identity too, and not have that same, that feeling of like, no, I'm not enough. I'm not Indigenous enough. It doesn't count. And I think that's partially the Métis experience too, because the whole like half-breed thing, where when Canada was first starting to be settled, Métis people being like driven out of Indigenous communities and out of white communities, and kind of having to live on the side of the road and sort of break ground. And, so I think that's kind of part of that experience too.
Okay, I have a big question, and there's not a wrong answer.
Okay.
And I feel like you and I can have this conversation because of the, the relationship that we've developed as a white person trying to do more of this work. How do we avoid tokenism? How do we avoid making someone feel like they're only getting that call or that opportunity because of that?
Yeah. Great question. And I wouldn't have had an answer for this until recently, because when I started doing this show on CBC, and it's all Alberta artists. So I have to find people of all genres, of all identities within one province to play on this show, which, the show is great. But it definitely sought to have representation of at least one person of color per show, per hour. My shows have, it's not so much about a formula. It's about, when I look at the playlist, do I see people represented? What I've done is develop my own library, and I've continued to seek out, different gender identifying people. I've sought out different people of different cultural backgrounds. And so it's not like I play one person of color and then maybe one, gay dude or something. It's like, what can I do with this time? Who can I showcase? I have to do hours and hours of research to find these people, but it's worth it. And now I can just I have these people to pull from always. And it's just really, I think it's about continuing to not have just one. Because I feel like as an Indigenous person, we have to, in a way, compete for one spot in one show
all the time.
And it shouldn't be that. It should be about, hosts developing their own library and seeking out people who have been underrepresented and working to represent them. So that if I'm playing, an Asian person on my 1 hour show, it's not because I've decided that I'm going to give one spot up. It's because I heard their music while I was doing all of this research and I loved it. And there's another Asian person. There's also this Black person. I also have, a trans man on my show, as well as like a couple of Native folks and like three or four white people. It's not about numbers. It's about the development of your own library.
Yeah, totally. So funny too, because like recently, we started looking at how we're going to track our diversity in a big company environment. Mm-hmm. And it felt so wrong going through the libraries and coding songs with what the little diversity factors are. And I got really down when they asked us to do that. I was like, and I get it, because we want to know where we were and where we are 6 months from that point. I get it. But it doesn't feel right to be coding people and humans like that. So I have a tough time with it.
It's tough because it's like a step that needs to be done. Similar to the Indigenous Juno Artist of the Year. It's something that it's something that had to be there in order to get representation, but we need to continue to do the work and get past that so that we don't even need these things, but we're just not there yet.
True. That's a very good point. And you know what, even with the Indigenous Juno, there's a huge conversation going on about contemporary Indigenous music versus traditional roots, powwow, those things. If we don't pass along those stories from different generations, they go away. It's so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about your most empowering experience as an Indigenous radio host or artist.
Well,
it might be the Juno.
Yeah. Well, once again, that was kind of a situation in which I felt like I was competing with my community for one spot. So it was like, I was grateful and stoked because I got a Juno, because that's what I always dreamed about. But at the same time, I got it instead of my pals, because we all know each other. There's
a built-in guilt and shame in that alone.
There is, because it's like, I'm so happy I got this. I'm so happy I got this, but I got this instead of other people that I think deserve this as well. So that might not have been my most empowering moment, but it certainly was like one of my biggest dreams achieved ever. But I think it honestly was my first residency with Manitoba Music in 2018. It was 1 week. And I went there and I didn't know anybody except Leela Gilday. And I left with like best friends forever. Wolf Sega was there, Sebastian Gaskin, Lacey Hill, Desiree Dorian, Isla Barker was there. That's where I met Alan Grey Eyes. There's so many more people. I know I'm forgetting names, but Jaylee Wolf was there.
Sense of belonging is what you're
the first time ever in my life. I remember leaving that place and being like, I just felt that's something that other people have felt their entire lives. All of a sudden, it was like I understood who I was in a way that I'd never understood before. And I was 38 years old.
You're going to make me cry right now.
I'm trying not to. Like, it was honestly, and I, in a way, it makes me so sad that it took that long to feel that. But God, did it ever change my life?
Yeah. And helped you step into a different sense of confidence too within your music.
It changed me completely. It like thinking about it. And then anytime I get a chance to meet with these folks again, it's just like, it changes me every time. It just makes me stronger. It makes me better. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about a big lesson, one of your tougher moments that you had to overcome.
God, there's been so many.
Girl, I could go on for hours.
I think, I struggled with self-worth for so long. And I remember I never felt like I was good enough to do this. But at the same time, I had this, I've always wanted to be a singer. I started singing on stage when I was 4 years old. And from that point on, and it had a lot to do with like the fact that my mother also wanted me to be a singer. That certainly pushed me towards it a little bit more. But it truly feels like my calling. When I'm on stage, I connect with people in a way and I feel it. And there's an exchange of energy. And all I want to do is just like share love. My capacity for love is like, it's honestly, it's not even my own. It comes through the top of my head and it comes out through my body. It's a channel. It's like I'm a conduit for love. I feel that completely. And it's something that I know I'm supposed to do. So it's something that's carried me through having very little self-esteem, feeling like my body wasn't good enough from a very young age, feeling like, the stories that I had to tell aren't really worthwhile. They didn't fit in with this thing. They didn't fit in with this thing. So luckily I've had that sense of purpose that's what's carried me through. So I think one of the more difficult challenges for me to overcome was taking leadership of my career. When I decided, okay, it's not about me needing a band. It's about me writing my songs, singing them the way that I want, and hiring the people that I need. I always relied on having men. I always relied on having men around, like my guitarist or my bassist or somebody or my boyfriend. And it was like this very like codependent thing that I was doing all the time. And I always dated the musicians I was playing with. It just always happened. I couldn't help it. I spent all my time with them. And also it's just like, it was this need that I had. And when I finally said, this is about me, this isn't about anybody else, and I have to become a boss. And it was like when I stepped into that boss role, and then all of a sudden I'm firing people and I have to have really tough conversations. And I have to start taking on all the work myself. And all the responsibility for everything is mine. That was kind of like, that was my biggest hurdle because of those like underlying issues that I had. But at the same time, as soon as I started to do it, those underlying issues started to like go away. I started to empower myself. So it was like the most rewarding challenge to take on.
Yeah. So tearing it up and putting it back together.
Yeah, exactly. Lighting it on fire.
Yeah. You do have an all-male band right now, don't you?
I do.
Okay. Yeah. And they're your band though. They're hired to tell your story and help with your art.
Yeah.
How does that look different than before in like a band practice, let's say?
Yeah, I think so. What it is there's a huge disproportionate number of male musicians to female musicians and non-binary musicians. And that's a huge bummer. So what the people that I'm working with right now are like, it's formed relationships through time. I have worked with women before and I have loved working with them, but it was really, when it comes to music and the type of music that I'm creating, it's really just about the right person for that job. And there are people in my band that are staples in my band. And there are people in my band who I kind of I can hire out whomever. So my band isn't really a solid band.
It's fluid. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. My guitarist and my keyboardist are the two guys who travel with me as a trio. But yeah, it is fluid. It really is. Like when we went to Germany, what is time in 2019? MJ Dandino played with us, and she was actually organizing a tour for me to play in Europe, and she was going to be in my band for that tour as well. So yeah, it's really just about who's available and who's exactly the right fit.
Mm-hmm.
Things would probably look different if I were in Ontario.
True. I also bet it's pretty empowering though, being the boss of all the dudes when they're hired.
I mean, I've always been, I've always had leadership qualities for sure. But it is it is also really, what's been really great about working, especially with Braden and Brennan, the guitarist and keyboard I work with, is it's been quite a learning experience for them too. They've attended a lot of Indigenous events with me.
And they're not Indigenous, true.
They're not Indigenous, but they've learned a lot. We've also had a lot of conversations about, I'll just give a little trigger warning. We've had a lot of conversations about like my sexual assault history, and they are available and around. They support me when I need support in certain situations that maybe feel unsafe to me. So like, it's just pretty wild, like how close the three of us have become, because as I'm like traveling around the world and playing music, there are triggers or there's things that happen all the time. And if I didn't have these people with me, supporting me, I'd feel pretty alone in it. So I feel pretty loyal to them because we've built this like amazing relationship where they can really support me in the way that I need.
Mm-hmm. And what a beautiful thing that they're open to learning about all the Indigenous stuff and all the hardship. And
yeah, I mean, they both were already like very, very open-minded, very liberal people. And they already had a lot of information, but they've seen a lot of things firsthand since working with me. And they've learned a lot from that.
Yeah. With your sexual assault history, did that have anything to do with being in the spotlight?
No, actually, it was all kind of previous to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. More recently, things have sort of been coming to the surface. I'm really great at like compartmentalizing things and putting them away. But yeah, definitely working through things. And that's also been really empowering because I've noted the way that I behave sometimes, and I'm realizing I don't have to fold into myself in certain situations. I am safe. There's lots of stuff I'm learning. It's really great. I'm better than I've ever been before, and I love it.
Yeah, you don't hear everyone say that during a pandemic.
I know.
Very good news.
I almost feel guilty saying that.
Don't feel guilty. It's okay. You've had 20 years of trying to figure yourself out. Let yourself have it, please.
Yeah.
Come on. What's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given, whether it was towards your music career or in radio, or could be from a mom or dad, doesn't matter.
The truth is, the best piece of advice I ever got was when I worked at Grand Prairie Friendship Center a couple of times. First time at the preschool. Second time, I was the program director for 3 years. It was the longest I ever had a real job. My boss at one time, she's since passed away, but she was a mentor to me. I loved her so much. She was kind of scary. She was kind of harsh. She had these long, scary nails, and she's just a powerhouse of a woman. And she just knew her mind. And it was just like, who is this woman? You know? She said to me, and I know this is a common phrase, but I'd never heard it before. She said, "How do you eat an elephant, Kaylee?" I had all this work I was doing. It was piled up. I was like, I can't do this. I was so overwhelmed. And I said, I don't know, Melody. And she said, one bite at a time. And I have thought about that. I've thought about that every time that I have a whole pile of things in front of me. And I'm just so overwhelmed, I can't even start. And I realized, yeah, just one thing. Start with one thing.
And that translates so well, whether you're talking about therapy and, one thing at a time with therapy, or an album, one song at a time. Like it could be anything.
It can be like one project at a time. It could be like 1 minute at a time. It's whatever it needs to be. But it's really, that's something that really stuck with me.
So part of this podcast is to build a little bit of a community, and I want there to be Indigenous women in this community. Tell me 3 people you think need to come on this podcast and tell their stories.
I think Anaknid would be really interesting to talk to. I haven't met her yet, but I've listened to her music and I've read her bio. And from what I gather, the reason why I think she would be so interesting to talk to is because this is a woman who seems very empowered with not only like understanding and recognizing her ever-changing sort of like her her moods, her personality, and being open to express herself completely and being authentically herself, her sexuality as well. I think it's really about like, Anaknet is somebody who presents as, you take me as I am, and I am all things, and that's okay. I feel like there's been lots of times in my life when I felt like I had to be one thing or be this thing in order for, someone to like me or to be accepted. But I see Anaknet as someone who's completely in their own power in all the ways. And I think a conversation with her would be so amazing.
Cool.
I think GR Grit, because they've been identified as female and they've been identified as male. And I've seen something that Gray has written about it and how those experiences, like how that's kind of shaped them, and also the awareness that they had of the treatment that they received as when they were different genders. I think Gray would be a great person to have on the podcast. And the last person I think would be great to have on is Krista Couture. She is someone who is a musician. She is an author. She just released a book. I think she has a couple other ones. And the book is called How to Lose Everything. And it's all about grief. And she has lost, I believe, 2 children. She also is queer and she has lost her leg. She's disabled. So, but she is releasing music. She's writing books. She has worked through all of this, or is working through all of this. And I think that her story, like hearing that would just be super empowering. And also the representation of like queer, indigenous, and disabled people is so important.
Yes. Oh my gosh. All 3 of these guests, I'm like, we got to line this up.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing. So what advice, to wrap up here, would you give your younger self?
If I could talk to 20-year-old Celeigh, I think the first thing that I would, actually any younger musician who is Métis, indigenous, what empowered me the most was finding a community. And that is the first thing that I would do if I could go back in time. Find indigenous people who empower me, who give me permission to understand and get to know this part of myself that, now is just such a huge part of my purpose and has changed my reasons for playing music and for being out in the media. When I feel introverted, shy, uncomfortable, I remember that this is the reason why I'm doing this and I need to keep going. So I think it's really all about finding a community and a place that you feel home, that you can come back to, and that empowers you.
Well, I loved this episode so much. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It was so nice to talk to you.
You too. I guess we'll leave a little teaser that you're working on new music. And when can we expect this announcement?
I don't know. The secret project that I've been working on, I don't know when that's going to be announced, but I am releasing a new song on June 2nd. So that's coming out.
I've linked to Celeigh's social accounts in the episode notes so you can keep up with her new releases or perhaps discover her music for the first time. Her voice is just so good. Thanks so much for listening to the new episode of the Women in Media podcast. You can keep up with new episodes and all that at Women in Media Pod on Instagram and Twitter, or facebook.com/Women in Media Pod. I'm the host, Sarah Burke, and you can find me at Burke Talks if you'd like to follow along there too. Wherever you're listening to your podcasts, if you'd kindly hit subscribe, you'll get an alert when I've got a new episode out. And if you're really feeling it, well, hey, I will take a review wherever you're listening to. Until next episode, do hit the link in the episode notes to hear Celeigh Cardinal's take on the Tragically hips ahead by a century. And thanks so much for being here.
Don't skip this ad. I saw your finger. You were trying to skip the ad. I didn't want to do this, and now we're stuck in it together. I'm Ryan. I'm the host of The Linz Report. The Linz Report is a snarky, humorous, yet balanced look at the headlines that fill your timeline every day. We're going to get straight to the point without muddying any of the waters. And remember, The Linz Report is not your parents' news commentary. We swear a lot here, like a whole lot. So tune in and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and find us at criermedia.co. or wherever you get your fine podcasts, like they say at the end of all of these ads. It's podcasting. Why are we doing ads?
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.